Welcome to the mixtape with Scott. This is Scott Cunningham. I'm the host. This week, it's a real honor and a pleasure of mine to introduce you to a man that you either have heard of or you haven't heard of. I guess that's true, but for everyone, but this feels even more true. Dr. Nick Cox. Dr. Nick Cox is a legend for many of us that are heavy users and longtime users of the statistical software Stata. Nick has been someone who has been a major contributor to the community of people that use that software, and has done so both in his production of user created packages, editing the Stata journal, and also managed or being one of the moderators on the long-standing Stata listserv. I wanted to talk to Nick for a couple of reasons. One was this podcast is an oral history of the economics profession, and the more I've thought about it, Stata, ironically, I think actually is part of the story of economics. People can laugh at that, but for people my age, and really even younger, when you think about the shift that occurred in the latter part of the sort of towards the closing end of the 20th century, I guess, for about a quarter of a century there, as the field of economics just began to become increasingly empirical, which was helped both by advances in microeconometrics, computing, but also software. That required economists with skills in econometrics as well as programming to help create that. And we had an interview recently with Bill Greene where we sort of learned a little bit about that. But the Stata software was really important part of empirical microeconomists being able to do their work. And it was and so Nick was an important part of that. But it's more than that. It was more than that. I've always looked up to Nick for complicated reasons. I would watch him on the Stata listserv, and I knew that there was a tendency on all online communities for them to kind of have commons problems, for lack of a better word. There was always a version of tragedy of the commons that exists on online communities. They get overrun with trolls. And so in order to create something that actually creates value, it usually requires a person to go first. And that's what I usually call it, a person who goes first, that tries to set the tone and kind of create the institutions that are going to allow for productive discourse. And Nick was someone that I saw that did that day in, day out, constantly communicating to people on this listserv. And as a result of that, just allowed it to produce a lot of knowledge and knowledge sharing. And I really took it to heart. That was what I wanted to somehow figure out a way to do in the profession itself. I wanted to find out a way that I could sort of help do that. And I tried to do that in my own ways. Nick was someone that I kind of watched. He was himself. And I've always thought that the production of these public goods and the production of science itself is much more complicated in today than it's ever been. And it requires people like that. People that go first, people that help create the institutions and the tools that allow us to do our work. And but also the just creation of community is important, and it's important to me. So I'm very excited to have him and to introduce him to you. This was a really meaningful interview for me. It went on. And so I requested with Nick if we could do a two-part interview, part one and part two. So this is going to be part one, and then later next week we'll do part two. I hope you enjoy it. Please tell everybody about the podcast if you enjoy it. Thanks a lot. This week is really special in the story of empirical microeconomics. But it's really just also the story of so many fields. I have with me Dr. Nick Cox from the University of Durham. Is that right, Nick?
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. Okay, Nick. So tell me your title, and is it the and you can tell me who pays your paycheck.
Well, it's just doctor if anyone wants to use that, and it's the University of Durham. Absolutely, I'm an employee. Have been an employee for almost 50 years.
Yeah, and well, great. Well, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Fine.
Okay. Well, before we get started, I wanted to do a little icebreaker. Tell me a vacation that you took as a kid with your family, whether it was you were little. Well, yeah, I say as a kid. Tell me a vacation that you took as a kid with your family that you still think about from time to time.
Oh, right. Well, of course, it was the late Stone Age or whatever. But yeah, I was brought up on Merseyside, which you may have heard of, opposite Liverpool, which you've probably heard of.
Yeah.
And that's about, I don't know, 20 miles away from the Welsh border. So we used to go into Wales quite a lot and go to the seaside and things like that. So that was pretty standard stuff. We never went very far as a family for all sorts of reasons, mostly money.
Yeah.
But yeah, what my parents liked to do was basically sort of go into the country and walk around a bit. They weren't great for hills or mountains. That was more what my brother and I picked up a bit later. But they certainly liked scenery and having a picnic in the open air, and that's about it, really. Fairly mundane.
What'd your parents do for a living?
Okay, well, my father did all sorts of different things. What he did most of all was sell fertilizers to farmers. And, or rather, he sort of supervised people who sold fertilizers to farmers. So he was called a sales representative. With great inflation, he'd probably be probably called some sort of manager if he was still doing it now. 60 years later. He left school about age 16 in 1929, I think, which every economist will know was not a terribly good time to leave school. But he sort of worked in various things, but mostly in sales. My mother worked as a kind of accounting assistant, although she took time out to be I think in the US you'd say a homemaker.
Yeah.
It was a time when once you were married, a woman was expected to just stop, which is, of course, pretty somewhere between ridiculous and obnoxious by most of our standards now. But that's what was expected when she got married, which was 45. She did go back to work much later on, again, doing things like accounting, keeping the books for charities, actually.
And you had one, and you grew up did you say you grew up in Liverpool?
Well, I grew up across the river from Liverpool in a little town called Bebington. And I went to secondary school in Birkenhead, which some people may have heard of. A trivium that not many people know is that Birkenhead Park was the model, supposedly, for Central Park in New York.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Not many people have heard of Birkenhead Park, but a lot of people have heard of Central Park.
Well, what's Liverpool like for a kid? I mean, if you're across a river, does that mean you get to go to Liverpool frequently, or is it separated?
Yeah, we'd go to Liverpool for big shopping, buy some major item or cultural things, concerts. Well, 60s we're talking about, really. Deindustrialization was biting pretty hard, but certain things were vibrant. The thing most people have probably heard of is the Beatles, and other people like that. And we were aware of that. I never went to concert or anything by them, but that was something we were aware of. The Mersey Beat, and certain poets and so forth.
Did the music
and
scene?
I can even do a passable imitation of a Merseyside accent, but I'm not going to try that in public. I don't know what my accent sounds like to you. Probably sort of British neutral or something like that. But
yes, British neutral. I can understand you. So I'm sure my accent sounds bizarre. I'm from Mississippi. So what did you and your brother? You said your brother, is he sort of a similar, close in age?
Yeah, my brother, 3 years older. We were lucky enough to go to a fairly academic school.
Okay.
My parents, as I've implied, didn't go to university, but we both went to university and both did PhDs and both went into academia.
What kind of stuff did you guys like to do when you were little? You and your brother? Were y'all close when you were little?
Pretty close, yeah. Well, we were right on the edge of the urban area, really, and so you just had to walk 5 minutes, and you'd be in fields and woods and so forth. So you'd mess around a bit and even play football and cricket in a very rough sort of way. We were both very bookish, I think it's fair to say.
What kind of books were y'all? What kind of bookish kids were you?
Oh, well, all sorts. I mean, there was a culture, well, certainly a family culture, but we weren't unique in it by any means. Culture of going to the library every Saturday and getting out books and then taking them back the next week. And there's certainly books in the house, but it was more reliance on a public libraries, which were pretty good. Good.
Yeah.
Now I think they've sort of morphed into more kind of information centers where you have access to computers in public libraries, and people come in out of the cold sometimes, but they were a good basis for reading novels, teaching yourself a lot of stuff, getting out nonfiction books.
Yeah. You ever gone back to that library that you would go to? You ever gone back to that library?
No, it'd be interesting to see what it was like.
I think the ceilings are a lot smaller than you remember. I did it recently. I was like, what? This is a small building. It felt huge when I was a kid.
Well, it was good enough to, what can I remember? They subscribed to Nature, meaning Nature magazine, which some people will know what that means, but probably a very easy translation is the British equivalent of Science magazine.
Yeah.
Right. So this is a small civic library, but they took the top Science magazine. It was just there for people to read, and they had lots of good reference books and so on and so forth.
So from a little kid, you were. Sorry, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say I don't remember using the word nerd or geek when I was 13. It may have existed, but it wasn't a word we used. There were other words as well, which weren't really rude, but what did people used to say? SWAT. Yes, a SWAT. A SWAT was, a kid who, studied fairly hard in school and took studies seriously. And
so you worked really hard as a student.
Really hard. Well, no, I just did what I was supposed to do, I think.
Okay.
Which was not completely usual.
Yeah.
No, I did my homework conscientiously and took most subjects seriously.
Yeah. So was it science? Because you've mentioned science and outdoors a few times. I'm curious, were you, as a young kid, sort of gravitating towards the natural sciences?
No, not really. I was interested in most academic subjects, and I guess retrospectively, it was largely a matter of the best teachers having the most effect.
Yeah.
But the way to summarize it, I think, is that we specialized early, and the British school education is one of the best in the world, and in some ways one of the worst in the world. A way in which it's bad is students encouraged to specialize early or obliged to specialize early.
Right.
Anyway, from age 15, I was focusing on geography, economics, and mathematics. And the way that works was geography was my top subject. That was my favorite subject. And I think I had a sense then I was going to study it at university. I didn't have ambitions beyond that at that point. Mathematics was something I wanted to keep going. And there was a sense that geography was becoming more mathematical. So I got strong advice that I was happy to take to keep going with maths as long as I could.
Mm.
And so that was quite well taught, at least as far as I was concerned. And we were getting into calculus, and a lot of calculus, a lot of algebra, a lot of trigonometry, a lot of geometry. Essentially no statistics, by the way.
Mm.
I don't think in the mathematics we were doing, we did anything more than averages.
Mm.
But in something like geography, we were certainly drawing diagrams and so forth. And some of that has lingered in what I do.
Yeah.
Economics I did partly because it sounded quite interesting.
Mm-hmm.
But I did it partly because I wanted to do physics, and that just didn't fit in the timetable. In fact, the school was stretching it quite a lot to allow people to do geography and mathematics, but it so happened that there were a bunch of us who wanted to do geography and mathematics. And the headmaster was married to a mathematician, and he had a awe and respect for mathematics, and he just told people this should happen, rearrange the timetable so that half a dozen of us could do geography and mathematics. But the only way that could be done was by the third subject of three that we were doing being either economics or history, and I went for economics.
Oh,
I couldn't do physics. So if people, I'm imagining most people listening to this are economists, and if they're wondering, how close was I to becoming an economist, the short answer is not much. But little bits of economics that I did late in secondary school have helped make sense of what economists do, or at least what I think they do.
Right. You've spent your career around a lot of economists, though. It seems like I want to get to that later, but more than
let's get to that later. I think
more than most non-economists, it seems like you've had to talk to them a lot.
That's probably true. We'll get to that later, I think, because we're not out of secondary school yet. We may need to speed up a bit.
Yeah. So what did you, when you were kind of, we call it high school, the last before
high school, secondary school, secondary school. So we say secondary school. Yeah.
So when you were moving towards the end of secondary school, was there, you're going to specialize in geography at the university and mathematics too, but did you ever have at that time a vision of what kind of life you wanted to have after university?
Okay, well, retrospectively, what I was interested in does tally with what happened. I can't say that I planned it at the time. I mean, I was certainly interested in the statistical side of geography from an early age. And that was, in the first instance, that was a matter of, liking playing around with data and drawing graphs and so forth. But I was on my own, away from formal studies. I was reading a little bit about stuff, and I remember reading paperback Penguin. Well, Penguin's still a publisher that's going strong. And there was a Penguin paperback called Geography of World Affairs by a man called John Cole. And in 1965, they had something at the end. Oh, here's some stuff with Spearman rank correlation. And I thought this was fun, which is probably not the usual reaction to learning about Spearman rank correlation, but I did. And so I played around with this. And the other thing was I went to a conference much, much later, about 20 years later, and who was sitting opposite me at lunch? But John Cole. But I never got to sort of Shanghai him and say, you changed my life. So, your little book got me interested in statistics and geography. Other things would have got me interested in statistics and geography anyway, but his little book did. So
that was in secondary
rank
school?
Correlation was the sort of thing I was playing around with. Very, very naive, but there you go.
That was in secondary school? Statistics and geography?
Yeah.
So you were already thinking, there is going to be a way for me to do something with statistics potentially, even though I'm going to specialize in geography.
No, that's probably going beyond what I was thinking at the time. You know, I was drifting too. But yeah.
You were drifting. What does that mean?
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, my interests were sort of shifting left and right, and
Yeah.
I got quite interested in philosophy in a very amateur sort of way, and some other stuff.
Mm.
I suppose some things became clear negatively. I mean, for example, I was useless at experiments in science, so
Mm.
that was something that, as it were, put me off science. I knew I wouldn't be very good at it, and I remember burning myself once and spilling acid on myself once.
Mm.
Fortunately, what was on the bottle called concentrated nitric acid or something of the sort was nothing of the kind. Otherwise, the
Oh,
injury might have been. But I was, no, I was a, you know, okay, let's choose one of your good words. I was a klutz in terms of, you know, experiments and so forth. I think that's the right word. So,
yeah, right, right.
I hope it's not rude.
Those,
Is it rude?
well, so
Klutz?
yeah, klutz, clumsy.
It's not a rude word, is it? I mean,
No, no. Those are
no.
one of those
Okay.
nice. Those are one of those nice words that are from a long time ago. That I haven't heard in a long time. But yeah,
Oh,
uh,
really? Well, I'm using it to mean clumsy. Perhaps that's wrong.
no, it is. No, it's like it just seems almost like I would see that kind of thing in old comic books, but I haven't heard it in a long time. Your
Oh, wow. There you
skills,
go.
your skills in science, they're not on the lab. They're not in the lab.
That's
That
right.
kind
No,
of
I was never a good lab person. I mean, we did that until, you know, we did physics, chemistry, biology, but experimentation was never my kind of thing.
what are professors telling you? They're saying, Nick, this is you got to get out of the lab. You're going to kill yourself. You
Oh,
got.
no.
What are they
No, I mean,
saying?
the only discouragement I got was I was fooling around playing a bit of cricket and made a tough move. And the chief geography teacher was passing and he just shouted, just keep to geography. So that was the only discouragement I got.
So in
And he
college,
was positive about me. I was top in geography, so he was positive about me. But there we
yeah.
go.
So wait, where are you in college at this time?
Uh, when did I do my undergraduate degree? You saying?
Yes.
Yeah, I went to Cambridge.
You went to Cambridge. Now, what
Yeah,
year is it? What year are you at Cambridge?
1970 to 73.
So in 1970 to 73, did you was there what was your first kind of encounter with computers?
Not at all.
Not at all.
Not at all. I mean, there was a big university computer. It didn't feature in our lives. There was a voluntary course to learn some programming that wasn't part of the, you know, wasn't part of anything graded or that contributed to your degree or anything like that. There was a voluntary course, and I did actually have a strong feeling that that was dangerous for me because I would find it compulsive. Okay, so let's backtrack slightly. Between school and university, I had a vacation job, great vacation job, working as just a scientific assistant.
Uh-huh.
But it was on a project where people were measuring evaporation from a forest. And what they had was a big tower that went up through the trees and into the atmosphere, and they're measuring temperatures and moistures and things like that at different heights, both within the trees and above the trees.
Mm-hmm.
And this was all being fed into a computer, a dedicated computer that was picking in, taking in the measurements real time and doing calculations and spitting out results. So I was aware of this computer, you know, in the caravan, and I wasn't manipulating it. I was just the least important person on the whole project, just as a vacation job.
Right.
£12 a week, more or less, I don't know, $15 a week, whatever it is.
Yeah.
Which is enough to save on, actually. But so I was aware of the computer, and okay, there's a small story that this thing was spitting out numbers every 10 minutes or whatever it was. and he was working on a program in real time, and they suddenly realized, oh, we need the ratio between this thing and that thing.
Mm.
And that's not part of the program. It's a Fortran program that was taking in stuff in real time. And so it was my job to calculate this ratio with an early electric calculator.
Yeah.
And I said, well, this is rounded. Which way is it rounded? Because we've got a numerator and a denominator. And they looked it up and they said, well, actually, it's rounded down in every case. So I was a bit of a jackass. And I said, well, there's a bias then. Because you need, a number plus a constant on top and a number plus a constant on the bottom. And just taking number over number will give you a bias. And they said, you're right. You do the work.
How old are you?
How
old are you when this is happening?
18.
18.
Yeah.
18, you're sort of having this sophisticated conversation with the computing people about bias?
Well, that's a nice way of putting it. Some people would summarize that as, an early occasion in which I was a bit of a jerk and said, no, that's wrong. So, yeah, in a minor way. I mean, it was just high school mathematics, really, just thinking about it.
So that's your first exposure to computing, and it was just,
yeah, that's right. Just being aware.
And it was in the context of statistics.
Yeah, being aware that there was a hydrological experiment going on with numbers and a computer in a big caravan. They just had this dedicated Hewlett Packard, actually, and I don't know if it was custom built or what, but probably not. But it was, it was the size of a big fridge.
Well, what'd you think when you had that experience? Were you curious about computing that?
Yeah, I got books out of the library, and I was just I wasn't working at home. I was working away from home, but I signed up at the local library and got books on computing programming out, and I had a sense this is going to be what I will do. But just not now.
When my family moved from Mississippi, which is a very, very poor state in the United States at the bottom of the country, and my dad had a computing company. This was like in the 80s, and a small town, personal computer seemed to be responsible for him losing a lot of contracts, local contracts, with doing the county payrolls and all these things. And eventually he moves to Memphis, but I ended up getting into running bulletin board systems. And and so I became part of like online communities sort of early on in high school. And this is kind of one of the directions I was just sort of wanting to go. Did you have any sort of experience with like online communities like bulletin boards or Usenet or anything like that before you started spending a lot of time helping with the Stata community?
No. I mean, let's catch up before we get there, as it were. We were just using electronic calculators as undergraduates. My computing experience started when I started doing graduate work, and there was then one mainframe in the University of Durham, period. But I was using Fortran to calculate things. So that was, we're now talking middle 70s, but that was long before there was any kind of internet or even, communities exchanging things. We didn't have email.
Right. What about
not within the university? That came much later.
What about in the academic department? Would you ever? When did you first start programming?
73.
1973. You're in college.
Yeah, when I started my PhD work. So yeah, just to explain, I didn't do a master's as such. I've got a master's from Cambridge, but that's a ridiculous arrangement whereby you just pay a certain sum of money and you upgrade a BA to an MA.
Oh.
And if anybody else did this, well, Oxford do the same thing. If anybody else did this, they'd say this is just utterly fraudulent. But Cambridge and Oxford have been doing it for centuries, that you can just get an MA by paying, I think it's £10, and they upgrade it. And I can't defend it, but I paid £10 and got my MA. But that was meaningless. But I just started on a PhD program straight after my first degree, and started computing straight away, just writing silly little Fortran programs. But point of possibly of some interest is that the university certainly had various statistical programs.
Yeah.
But none of them was programmable in any modern sense. I'm pretty sure they had SPSS.
Oh.
This is I'm talking about 73. They had SPSS, I think, and I think they had SAS below that.
Oh.
That was stopped. And
so you were using Fortran primarily.
Yeah, that's right. Because what I wanted to do, there was no way you could program it in a statistical environment. You just had to use a mainstream programming language. Of course, if we jump forward 50 years from now, and we may get to this later in the conversation, there are now lots of people saying, oh, it's stupid learning a statistical environment because you should just be using a proper programming language.
Right.
With all sorts of different interpretations about proper programming languages.
Right.
Well, anyway, 50 years ago, my move was the reverse. That I had, well, not the reverse. Anyway, it's the same thing. I had to use a proper programming language.
Yeah.
Because there was no sense in which you could program your own stuff in the software we had at the university.
Yeah.
Now, that was probably coming in terms of, say, S. When did S started up at Bell Labs, and that was certainly a programming language, a statistical flavor. That became R later, of course.
So you work with
we
S?
didn't have access
Are
to
you
that.
working with S? Do you start moving into the statistical software? Sticking with these?
I never used S as such. It was never installed on our system. I have used R occasionally.
Yeah. So but it's clear that computing is going to be a central part of your career once you get into that doctorate. That's going to be because you're managing to bring together the stats and the geography in your PhD. Am I understanding correctly?
Yeah, that's a good summary.
Okay. And where do you end up doing your PhD?
That was Durham. That's where I am now. I came here as a graduate student and then just morphed into faculty.
Okay. So you end up having this career as a geographer, and you're your own programmer. Is that correct? You're not necessarily you're not using some software. You're building your own you're building your own programming the whole time. Is that right?
Okay. If we try and summarize about, let's say my history before Stata and after Stata, as it were. Let's divide it up like that.
Yeah.
So and give a time point for people. I started using Stata in 1991.
91.
So I've been using it now for 32 years, and Stata itself started in 1985, as some people will know. Okay, now before Stata, I was using various mainstream languages. I was writing in Basics. A lot of people will have heard of Basics.
Yeah.
I was using statistical packages as well. I used SPSS about twice. Minitab quite a lot. Of course, both of those are still going. Whether they're going strong is a different question I won't look at, but Minitab's still around. SPSS is still around. I was using...
You weren't using SAS?
Called Midas. Pardon?
You weren't using SAS?
SAS, no. SAS has got a much bigger profile in the States than does in Britain.
Oh.
I mean, there are people who use it in Britain, but it's not I think nearly the standard in British universities. I could be wrong on that.
So you were using statistical software. You weren't just programming in Fortran.
Absolutely, yeah. I was right.
Were you satisfied? Were you satisfied with your options back then?
Yeah. I mean, your expectations are not very high. I mean, I started out with an environment, and what you did was you submitted a job on punch cards. So punch
Right.
cards would be your data and your code.
Yeah.
And then later, you know, well, later, of course, it morphed to you could actually sit at a terminal and type commands and so forth.
Yeah.
That was a terminal that talked to a mainframe. I mean, I can remember the transition from a text editor in which you couldn't see the file to a text editor in which you could actually see the file. You could see an image of the file on a monitor. But the first text editors I used were these Unix type text editors where you say things like, on line 1, you know, change this to this. On line 5, well, delete line 5, and so forth. Insert after line 6. But you know, I started out with punch cards, and then later, you know, well, that's a dead art now. You know, being able to punch cards and correct punch cards and silly things like that.
Right.
But later, of course, we were using terminals, and then you know, a phase with a so-called mini computer, and then, well, you know, using PCs, even if those PCs are networked, which is what's been standard for what, 20 years now.
The PC.
PC, no, 30 years probably.
The
30 years.
We used the PC in college in the mid 90s, and my dad had a IBM PS2 Model 30, 1989. So, but I think my dad bought it on a lark. He was sort of, you know, he had that computing company, so he bought it, and then I used it, but it was very uncommon. But we did have I graduated high school in 1994, and I remember us all getting a Vax and Unix email account, and there were personal computers in the dorms for printing out your papers. So it would have been like 94, 95. But nobody had, I didn't know anybody that had one. It just was at the school.
That's right. Yes.
Yeah. So 85 Stata comes out, 91.
Yeah, that's when I started using it myself. Yeah.
What happens? How does that happen? Is it just one of your mini software that you're working through, or what?
Well, I was doing what I've been doing most of my career, which is teaching statistics within geography. And I was always on the lookout for a good textbook. And there's a nice textbook by a guy called Larry Hamilton called Modern Data Analysis. It didn't get very far. It never went into a second edition.
Yeah.
But I saw that he'd written a book called Statistics with Stata, and I had heard a little bit about Stata. And Statistics with Stata was available for about $20, I think. And I got a hold of that. And there were two 5 1/4-inch discs with a cut down version of the software.
Yeah.
There's a good story about that, which I think I can make public. Because at the time, we're talking early 90s, it wasn't that unusual to get books with discs with software.
Yeah.
You know, you bought a book and there was a disc with software. Now, often it was just a kind of sales pitch, and it was often, this is a token program, and for the real program, send money, you know, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was a fully functioning version of Stata. Now there are two twists. One was obvious at the time, wasn't so obvious. The 2-disc business was just a bit of cunning, because the developers knew how to put it on 1 disc, but they thought if people see 2 discs, they're going to think, wow, 2 discs. That's what it was. So it didn't need to be on 2 discs, but it was, as you know, just a bit of marketing.
Right.
Anyway, it was a fully functioning version of Stata, but with one twist. You could only have 150 observations. So, you know, that's fair enough. They weren't going to give away the whole thing for free.
Right.
Now, it so happened that a particular data set that remains one of my favorites had 158 observations. So I thought, well, I've got a choice here.
What's that data set?
Either is
that the auto data set?
No. Well, the auto data set's just got 74 observations, and that's been bundled with Stata since whenever. Now, this is a data set I wanted to, you know, play around with, produced in fact by my PhD supervisor. And it got 158 observations. So I thought, well, I got a choice here.
You couldn't get
Either
it
I
on the
find some
150.
way of dropping 8 observations.
Yeah. Or I could
Or
buy
I
it.
just buy the whole thing.
Otherwise,
So,
I could play with my favorite data set. Oh, that's a great story.
yeah. So I just sent off to California and bought the whole thing, which was about $200.
So you'd never done that before. You had never had you ever made that kind of investment with the other languages, or you just had a local license or something with the other languages like SPSS?
That's a good question. I think I may have been buying some shareware things. Shareware is a thing that's more or less faded away, isn't it? But
yeah, shareware.
You could get good text editors, £20, $20, whatever. I did that sort of thing. Oh yeah, I did buy other things. Some were a bad decision, but
getting tied.
I did.
You're adopting because of the textbook. Is that why you're adopting?
Well, I mean, the textbook on statistics with Stata, I just like the look of it a lot. I just like the look of it. And the silly thing at the time, which might be puzzling to anyone who wasn't around, was that most of the output was lowercase. Because the mainstream or mainframe statistics packages would mostly expect uppercase input and produce uppercase output. But lowercase was becoming possible, and Stata was using lots of lowercase. And I thought this is nice and subdued. It's not as it were shouting at you.
Totally. Yeah.
And the language makes very heavy. Very few commands, for example, make use of uppercase at all. And
I wonder what DOS used. What did DOS use? I can't.
If you need to input uppercase text as an argument, that's one thing. The actual command and option syntax doesn't make heavy use of uppercase at all, which is now standard. But it was a bit unusual at the time.
Yeah. I've always thought that was really aesthetically nice too. When I first saw Stata, I liked that. Okay, so you get it. Now, again, I'm going to ask the question. At this time in 91, did you share your software that you had been written on Fortran? Would you pass around, reels or pass around, floppy disks to your colleagues? Were you sharing a lot of your programming products?
Only locally, but two things happened in 94. I think they were both in 94. Certainly one was. But that's good enough for anything but historical purposes. 1994, the company then called Computing Resources Center, later StataCore, the company started out a Stata Technical Bulletin. And the Stata Technical Bulletin came out every 2 months. And there was always a disk, now 3.5-inch disk this time.
Yeah.
And that had, as it were, user-written programs. So that was the way that people shared user-written programs. That you sent them into, let's say StataCore, even though it wasn't true at the time. You sent them into StataCore, and if they liked what you'd done, there'd be a little write-up in the Stata Technical Bulletin. And so that was running from 1994 to 2001. The other thing that was happening in 1994 was that Statalist started up.
That started up?
And that was an email-based discussion forum. And people were, putting code into mail. I mean, it was pretty awkward, but
it was snail mail. You're putting in 1994. You're doing a bulletin that's physical, printed out.
It's a list server. It's an email-based forum. 1994
based forum. Okay.
And
it's a board. Is it like a bulletin board, or is it actually by email?
No, you got email. You got email. If you were signed up to it, if someone sent a message to the server, then that would be distributed to everyone on the list. And so I don't know what the numbers were originally, but there'd be several email messages a day. The thing got moving fairly fast. It's a very interesting origin, actually, at least to me. What happened was that there was a medic called David Wormuth, And he was doing some course at Harvard School of Public Health. And he said, let's have a mail list where people can ask Stata questions and answer Stata questions.
Mm.
And one of the teachers at Harvard, who's still there, Marcello Pagano, said, yeah, we'll do this.
Mm.
And that carried on for 20 years. And Wilmuth was very emphatic. This should be independent of the company, right? This should be users supporting each other.
Mm.
And a lot of people thought that was a very important principle. In practice, that became difficult to sustain, although it was managed more or less for 20 years.
This is the Stata
But then
list.
2000,
The Stata list.
Stata list. Well, Stata list was then reinvented as a web forum, which is what people know now. But it's interesting that 2014, a lot of people said, no, I don't like this. And they dropped off. They preferred, probably as part of their daily routine, they preferred, just getting emails.
Yeah, right.
Deleting most of them straight away and then, doing what they want. And they didn't like the kind of extra thing of, well, you've got to keep looking at a web forum to see what's there.
So you're thinking, so you're saying it was an email Stata, it was an email listserv in the mid 2000s?
Right up to 2014. But
was what I used.
But first of all, there's still a thing called Our Help, which is organized in exactly the same way as if I understand it, although it's faded away. But that was the main, way in which many software communities ran, through an email-based list.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking, as it were, over the fence at other communities. You've heard of Stack Overflow, I guess?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Stack Overflow started out as a web forum with a particular style and so forth. And then there were all sorts of other communities on the side of that. And the most interesting one to me is Cross-Validated, which is essentially a statistics forum.
Mm-hmm.
And I looked at Stack Overflow because a lot of people were saying on Stata List, this is just so old-fashioned, it's ridiculous. And so you got people saying, oh, it's not broken, so we don't need to fix it. And other people saying, this is ridiculous, we need a web forum. So I was looking at web forums, and Stack Overflow just looked awfully complicated. I thought, this is awfully complicated. And there's a whole lot of things about badges and privileges, and you can edit other people's posts if you have a certain reputation, and you can, close posts unilaterally if you have a certain reputation, and so forth. And so my initial reaction was too complicated. But then I looked at it, and there were lots of Stata questions on Stack Overflow. They were getting lousy answers. Sure. Or no answers at all.
Right.
So I thought, so I dropped over the fence and started answering questions there. And when Stata List was having discussions about changing, I said, well, I think a web forum is the right idea. And other people agreed, which is why it happened.
Wait, so who's
a group about?
But y'all, I guess something about the listserv was dissatisfying. You guys, had to switch?
if you're just exchanging emails, then it's a pretty poor way of showing code.
Oh yeah.
Of showing data examples.
Yeah.
And it's useless. It's just useless for graphs.
Right.
So
right.
That was why most people said, yeah, we ought to bite the bullet and become a web forum.
Well, so Sean, did you, I'm kind of tipping my hand a little bit here, but you become a real prominent figure in the Stata listserv. Was that from the very beginning? You sort of were, becoming pretty prominent on that listserv and beyond just simply someone chatting?
Well, fairly early. I mean, I wasn't there at the start, and I can't answer that question because, in real accuracy, because the emails from about the first decade have all disappeared.
Oh no way!
But that doesn't really matter because I wouldn't want to read them all again. But no, from about
they're gone. Nobody.
From about the middle '90s, I was pretty active on Stata List. Yeah, it just grew.
How come? What is it about this that's drawing you in? Because it becomes a real, is it becoming your community? Are you finding yourself making friends on the Stata listserv?
Absolutely. Yeah, very much so.
Who were some of
And the
your
other thing that's important to this, sorry.
who were some of your early friends or that you became like they became kind of friendships with you?
Okay, there's really, although it's quite different in terms of organization, there's really a seamless web, because what Stata were doing from the middle 90s was holding user meetings.
Oh.
And so I've been meeting people. The very first one was actually in London.
Mm.
Uh, and the company was then in Texas. It started out in California, but it moved to Texas, where it still is, in College Station.
Yep.
And College Station is actually, well, I mean, College Station, you're, I don't know what it is, a couple of hours drive away.
Yeah.
Now, College Station is a great place to work in many ways and to bring up a family, but it's a lousy place for a conference.
Conference. Yeah.
So, whereas London, in
Yeah.
contrast, is a great place for a conference.
Right. Right.
Not just for people in the UK,
Yeah.
but people, in nearby countries of Europe or mainland Europe. So the first Stata meeting was in London in 1995. So I was meeting people, at these meetings, and the meetings in the States started out late 90s,
Did
soon
you
after.
organize those initial meetings? Were you the part of the organizer of those initial meetings?
I didn't organize the first London meeting, but I started organizing them, helping to organize them, from about 1997 or so, I guess.
What was their purpose?
Usually every other year.
I know what their purpose is more now, but what was it in the beginning? Just to meet people in person?
Well, usually Stata Core people would turn up and they would talk about what was happening with Stata.
Mm.
And you could certainly say, what I think is wrong, what I think Stata Core ought to do, and so on and so forth.
Mm.
And the answer was usually, we'll think about that. But most of the business was users talking about their work, and it quickly became people talking about the program as they were writing. Application talks where people just say, "Well, I'm using Stata for this bit of economics research or medical statistics research." They've always been a minority thing. It's usually been users talking about new commands that they've published, new packages that they've written.
Do you remember any package that I would have heard of that you saw sort of appear that's now kind of become like a major part of the software? What's one of those that you remember?
Well, there was a very impressive talk by Sophia Ray-Pesketh, who's now at Berkeley, but she was then working at one of the London universities. And she gave a talk on GLAM, GLLAMM, which was a pretty amazing program that did all sorts of mixed models and so forth. Now, Stata have implemented in that rather different sort of way. I mean, when I say Stata have implemented, I mean the company.
Yeah.
The company always has a kind of longer term perspective on things. And whereas an academic wants a program, tomorrow or even better yesterday,
yeah,
the company sort of, moved more and more towards sort of projects that may take about 4 years or so forth. I mean, the recent stuff on tables, where tables were rejigged, I think that took 2 releases to work through that. And they just think, and the company are thinking more and more about what do we want to do that academics can't do.
The company was.
Yeah, because the whole point is that the company is not trying to write everything.
Right.
I mean, you take something like meta-analysis, which is, well, it's a bigger deal on the medical side than the economic or social science side. It's not like meta-analysis. The users are actually doing great stuff, and the company, as it were, let that settle down before sort of folding it back into the official release.
Right.
And then stuff like, well, this is getting pretty close to your territory, I think, difference in difference and all that sort of stuff, and causal inference. There's a good phrase for you.
Yeah.
The company is getting into that, but they were, as it were, seeing what users were doing and seeing how the field developed, because there's no point in academics saying, "Oh, you should do X." and the company doing it, and they say, "Oh, well, no, X was last year's thing.
So they would use
Everyone's now doing this."
they'd use
Pardon?
they would use the listserv in the meetings, or not the, yeah, they would use the listserv in the meetings to get a feel for where the various trends were coming and where the demand was.
Absolutely, you got it one. You know, what do people want to do?
Okay.
And what are they doing fine by themselves? And what does the company want to get interested in? And the interesting thing is, to me, that the company are just like a bunch of academics.
Right.
Because sometimes you say, "Why didn't you do such and such?" And they say, "Well, that sounds good, but I don't think anyone in the company really wants to work on that."
Yeah.
And part of you is thinking, the community needs this.
Right.
And part of you thinking, well, these developers, they're just, I mean, they're usually people who, you know, they got PhDs and, you know, good masters and so forth. They just turned left and went into business. But they're like academics. They, you know, they work on what interests them, and they won't do something just because someone says, "Oh, you know, this is hard stuff."
Yeah.
You've got to be an interest.
Yeah. Nick, it is top of the hour. I want to make a proposal. Could we do a part 2? Because I think in the opening to this interview, I'm going to be saying a lot of flattering stuff about you, about you're a big part of, I think I told you by email, you're a monumental part of the story of economics. And I think even all the way down from the graduate students, you know, at least my cohort, all the way up to the Nobel laureates would absolutely say that. And I was wondering, could we do a part 2? I haven't actually done a part 2. I did maybe one part 2 with Alberto Abadi, but would it be okay if we do this? Because I want to keep these in an hour as much as possible, because people kind of drop off. But could we do another part 2?
Yeah, absolutely. Just send me some suggestions for a time.
Okay, great. Well, this is really fun.
Are you thinking this week, or are you thinking next week or something?
We could do this week, or we could do next week. I'll send you my calendar and you tell me what you want to do.
Okay, that sounds good.
Great. All right. Thanks so much for being on the show. And we'll be back soon. Okay.
Gotta see us through.